Well, good morning to you. I'm so thankful that we are able to worship together today. It's a beautiful Sunday. It feels good to have a good crowd with us this morning. Last week was our youth rally, and what a great success that was. I just want to thank Sean and Mandy for the great work that they've done with that. Our youth rally a few years ago was just on like a one-night kind of thing, and then it developed into a full weekend, and that was a great success the first year that we did that. And then last year, we didn't get to have the youth rally, and so this year was very much like a reset, and I am seeing such great potential with that weekend to be able to reach into our area and even beyond our area to reach kids and teenagers, and I'm so excited about that. And it was a wonderful worship last week, but this week it feels a little bit different because we don't have all those kids here with us, but it feels more like the way that it used to, doesn't it? And I love that. I love seeing a good crowd here this morning, and I'm thankful for that. This morning we're going to talk a little bit about talking to my neighbor. I told you a few weeks ago, I think we've hit, this is maybe number 3, talking to my neighbor who's different than me in some way or another. A neighbor who sins different than me is something we've already talked about. But this morning we're actually going to talk about talking to my neighbor who believes different than me. A few weeks ago we talked about talking to my neighbor who worships different than me. How do I reach people who believe in Christ but they worship different than me? And how do I bridge that gap? How do I reach people that are just different? But this morning we're talking about those that believe differently than me. Now, someone who believes differently than me is, like I said, not someone who is a believer in Christ. Okay, that's somebody that's somewhat on the same page as we are. But we're talking about somebody that's different. It's not somebody who has maybe just a different opinion about something. That's not what we're talking about this morning. It's not even someone who shares the same world view. We can share the same world view with people and find great common unity within us, in our community. Maybe not worship exactly the same way, but I'm not talking about reaching those people. That's not what we're talking about this morning. We're talking about somebody who believes differently than me, that does have this different world view. And you think, well, is that really even predominant? Well, I think it is. I think it's something we certainly need to address. And I'll show you something here in just a moment that will prove that point just a little bit more. I'm talking about someone who may be agnostic or atheistic. Now, agnostic means that they don't really know. That's the word right there, the agnostic. It comes from this Greek word of knowledge. Someone that just doesn't know whether God exists or not. And I know people who say, I'm agnostic. They even will say, I think we should just all coexist. And you've probably seen that bumper sticker or that graphic on social media of coexisting. And it's spelled out coexist with like a cross and like the Jewish star and all these different symbols of other religions. And how we all just need to get along because we don't really know what's right and what's wrong, or we don't really know if there is a God. And so that's somebody that's agnostic. Somebody that's an atheistic person is somebody that does not believe in God. They've perhaps made that decision already in their mind, and they've decided, I don't believe that God exists. So how do I talk to somebody like that? How do I talk to my neighbor who believes differently than me, that has that kind of different worldview? They may be even a part of a different world religion. We say America, United States, we are a Christian nation. Well, maybe. I think we have certainly some Christian foundations, and I think that we are predominantly that way. But that shift is turning. It's turning, and we're seeing that change in our culture around us. And we need to be prepared to be able to face those kinds of differences with our neighbors, because not everybody is going to have the same worldview that you have. There may be people who are Hindu, there may be people that are Muslims, there may be people that are Islamic, and they may be your neighbors, literally, right here in the little small rural town of Batesville, Arkansas. Right here. It's certainly in more urban areas, but even right here in our own town, I know we have people that have a totally different worldview than we do, and they are our neighbors. Now, I think this is interesting. This is a study that was done from the Barna Group several years ago. 2018 is when this one came out. And I just want to point out something that's really interesting about this. This just basically is telling us which of the following best describes your religious faith. That was the question that was proposed. And the idea here, if you'll notice, here's this chart up here. Most people are going to say that they're Christian or non-Catholic, or that they're Catholic or some other kind of faith. But the point that I want to really focus in is this area right over here, this agnostic group, or the atheist, or they just claim absolutely nothing, or just didn't know how to exactly answer that question. And that line right down here is actually this part right down here on the bottom of this chart. To kind of bring it a little bit further to you, just kind of point it out. And I want you to notice the progression. And it's weird that it reads it this other way, but you've got your elders and your boomers, your Generation X, your millennials, and then Generation Z. Generation Z is anyone that's born after about 2000, okay? Anybody born after 2000, which we have people right here. Y'all were all born mostly after 2000, right? That's Generation Z. And what I want you to notice about this is this shift in these people, the percentage of people that say that they're atheist or agnostic from the progression of time. And notice how that it jumps, especially in this area from the millennials to Generation Z. Those that are atheistic from 7% to 13%. 13%. You think, well, that's not very many people at all. Well, 13%, let's just think about it. If there's 100 people, then 13 of them don't believe in God. To me, that's a scary thing to think about. And what's interesting about it is we think, oh, that's people outside of this wall. That's the people in our community that may not believe in God, or that just don't know if God exists. But you know what? Sometimes I think we can have people right here in our own church family that don't believe, or that don't know, or they haven't made up their mind just yet, or some days they believe and some days they seriously doubt. Whatever the case is, we love our neighbors. We want to talk to them. We want to save them. We want to help them. And so this is a real need. This is something that we need to talk about, and we need to be willing to talk to our neighbors who believe differently than we do. It's so important. So important. And to do this, I want us to think about what's keeping us from talking to our neighbors. What's keeping us from talking? Sometimes it is just a lack of commitment. Commitment within our own hearts. Sometimes it's just a lack of preparation. We didn't do our homework. We don't really know what we need to do to get it done. And that leads to this next one where it's just a lack of knowledge. We don't know. We don't know enough about how to reach people who don't believe in God. We don't know how to talk to them. We don't know their facts and the facts of creation and the facts of our world around us. And we just don't know how to even have a conversation with people that just don't have the same worldview as we do. And sometimes it's just a lack of tact. And what I mean by that is sometimes we can be rude or condescending to people that just don't have the same views as we do. And we can turn them off by the things that we do say. So it's not just about not knowing what to say or a lack of commitment. Sometimes we say the things that need to be said, but we don't do it in a tactful way. And it turns them away. But we love our neighbors. And to alleviate these problems, these lacks that we're struggling through, I think there's a great passage that was read for us just a moment ago from 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, where Peter writes and says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." And there's 4 things that I want to point out to us from this one verse that will get us some confidence that will encourage us to alleviate those things that we're lacking in, whether it be the lack of commitment or preparation or knowledge or tact. I think we can learn from this verse. Before we get into it, though, I think it's important to know the context around 1 Peter chapter 3. I'm a big believer in what is Peter really trying to teach us right here. Not just taking one verse and saying, oh, this fits for what we're talking about. How does it fit with what the whole message that Peter is saying? What does he really want his readers to know? And so when you look at the context of 1 Peter chapter 3, you realize that from the very beginning of the chapter, he's talking about how Christians should behave, the proper conduct. He begins talking about how wives are to be submissive and respectful and modest. He talks about husbands and how they are to be understanding as they live with their wives and give honor to her. And then he talks about everybody, all people, how we are to be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble, and then just do good. Just do good. And that springboards right over to what he's going to talk about starting in verse 13. If we continue on in this context, we see he makes a shift talking about then persecution. Because when we do good in our communities, which our atheistic friends and our agnostic friends think that we should do, which is a fantastic argument when you're talking to people who are atheistic or that don't know if God exists, to talk about the moral argument, to talk about why is there good? Of course, they'll say, why is there evil? And that's a whole nother discussion. Actually, I'm going to Heber Springs in a few weeks on Wednesday night to talk to them about good and evil in the world. It flows right into this. But when you talk to your atheistic or your agnostic friends, it's good to talk about this moral argument, because even the atheist says that it's wrong for you to kill him. Even the atheist believes that it's wrong for you to go over to his property and steal something that's his and take it for yourself. But he struggles with finding exactly where that moral law comes from. And our point is that it comes from God. God gives us the moral law that we obey. And that's a good thing to think about. So Peter says, when you're doing good, when you're being a moral person, there's going to be times that people are going to persecute you. They're going to talk bad about you, and they're going to be mad at you for doing that kind of good. And you're going to have to face that kind of thing. And he says, now who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? It's almost like this rhetorical question. Surely there's nobody, but there is. And he says, but even if you should suffer for this righteousness' sake, you are going to be blessed. You're going to be blessed. So have no fear of them that are going to persecute you, nor be troubled. So that sets us up for the verse that we're talking about this morning, chapter 3 and verse 15, where he says, but in your hearts you honor Christ, the Lord, as holy, always being ready to make a defense while you're doing this good work, always being willing to ready and prepared to make this defense to anyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. That's the verse that we're going to concentrate on this morning. Because what we want to find out, what we want to examine is, how do I do this? How do I talk to my friends and my neighbors who believe differently than me? How do I do that? Well, I want to point out 4 things from this one verse, chapter 15. First of all, if we're going to lack in our commitment, then we need to alleviate that, and he tells us how to do that. He says, if we honor Christ in our hearts. You see, it begins with you, doesn't it? It begins with you making that decision. You've got to be committed. And if you're going to honor Christ, if you say that you honor Christ, if you say that you're a Christian, if you say, I am a part of the Lord's kingdom and I want to live right, then you're going to have to actually live right. You're going to have to actually do what you say. You're going to have to not just walk or talk this way. You're going to have to actually walk the walk. One of my preaching mentors and heroes was Carol Sides. Brother Carol Sides preached many years at the Higdon congregation. My grandparents knew him before he was even there at the Geyer Springs Church of Christ in Little Rock. He would always say, Alex, you need to practice what you preach and preach what you practice. You know what? And that's good for even Christians. If you're going to talk to your neighbors about Christ, you're going to have to live like Christ. You're going to have to actually do these things. And that's one of the arguments that the atheists and the agnostics will give us. They'll say things like, I would believe in God, but even Christians are immoral. You believe in God, but you don't act like you believe in God. You honor Christ, but you're not living like you honor Christ. You come to worship right now, but then some of us will drive off and swerve and cuss out the next person as we drive down the road. Or maybe we get bad customer service and we start acting like an idiot and really show that we're not living the way that we should by the way that we behave in the world around us. If you honor Christ, you're going to have to be absolutely committed to Him. If we're lacking commitment, we're going to have to be absolutely dedicated and devoted to living the way that we say that we're supposed to live. That's how we're going to make a difference. That's how we can talk to our neighbors who believe differently than us. Part of their argument is going to have to be, yeah, sure, Christians are not perfect. Christians make mistakes, but that's the whole reason we want to be Christians. That's the whole reason we want to follow Christ, because even when I make mistakes, I can find redemption and salvation and forgiveness. That's the whole reason for it. That's what we want to talk to our friends about. We need to live this way. And if we look on in the context of 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter really carries this point a little bit further. He says, but in your hearts honor Christ as the Lord as holy. Always being ready to make this defense. But keep reading with me in verse 16. He says, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. So we're going to have to honor Christ by the way that we live, and it requires us to have this good conscience and good behavior. That's how we're going to match up with what we say and with what we do. Live the way that we're supposed to live, and we can make a bigger difference. Now, number 2. So if we're lacking preparation, then for us to talk to our neighbors, it's going to require some preparation. It's going to require preparation. If we're lazy, then we won't be ready to answer their questions. We're going to have to do some prep work. That's what it's going to require. It's going to require us to do some legwork and be prepared for any kind of an answer that they may, or any answer that they're looking for, any question that they may ask. We're going to have to do some work. It doesn't just come naturally. We're going to have to study. We're going to have to put some effort into it. And that's what's so important about this. If we're lacking preparation, then we're going to have to get ourselves prepared. Isn't that the way it is in school? Sure, where you've got a test coming up, you've got something that's coming up, and if you're not prepared for it, you won't know what to do. It's going to require preparation if you're going to make any difference at all in talking to your neighbors. If we keep reading, he says, always being prepared. Always being prepared. That's the key phrase right there in 1 Peter chapter 3. Always being prepared. Now when you think about this passage from 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verses 1 through 4. Timothy reads this letter from Paul, and Paul says, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by His appearing and His kingdom, preach the word. And I love this phrase right here. Be ready in season and out of season. And he tells them further on exactly what to do with those, how to preach that word. But the phrase that I really want us to think about is this being ready in season and out of season. In and out of season. See, there's times that what we preach is in season. In other words, people are willing and ready to hear it. And then there's times that people don't want to hear it. And we've got to be prepared for both in and out of season climates. Both in and out of season situations. Where people want to hear it, that's easy. When people don't want to hear it, that's the struggle. And a lot of times our atheistic friends and our agnostic friends or Buddhist or Islamic or Muslim, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. And if we'll preach the Word even more, maybe we can make a difference in their lives. It's going to require us to do it in and out of season, no matter what. All right, number 3. It's going to require logical reasoning. Logical reasoning. I think it's so important for us to go ahead and do the homework, do the preparation to be able to give our atheistic and our agnostic friends some logical answers. If we sufficiently present the evidence, then it should warrant a reasonable conclusion. But it's going to take some study. It's going to take some reasoning with people. I love this phrase right here, that when they ask for a reason for the hope that is in you, the logic. Why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why are you doing this good, even though you're persecuted? Even though you suffer for righteous sake, why do you do these things? Well, there's reason, there's logic behind it. And we need to be willing to do that. We have to be willing to do that. I love this right here. Make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. Now, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 19 through 20, Paul perfectly shows to the Romans the reason and the logic and the way that God is in creation. And he tells them this: for what can be known about God is plain to them, those that don't believe in God or those that are non-followers of God. It's plain to them because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, those two things, they've been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Our agnostic friends and our atheistic friends, they should look around to creation and they should be able to see that there is some intelligent design that's there. A few months back, I took a class finishing up a master's degree in biblical studies, and one of the classes was advanced apologetics, which is interesting because the word defense that's in our passage that we're reading about this morning in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, to give a defense, that word is apologia, apologetics, to give a defense. And so I was taking this class, and one of the assignments was to read certain books about apologetics, right? That makes sense. One of the books that I chose to read was a debate from 1976 between Thomas B. Warren and Dr. Anthony Flew. It was in Denton, Texas. There were thousands of people that were gathered together to listen to this debate. And Thomas B. Warren wiped the floor with Anthony Flew. It's on YouTube. You can go back and watch it and read. Actually, that's what I did. I would watch and read the debate at the same time. It was very, very wonderful. But the fact is that there is intelligent design that we can see in creation. What I love about this is that years later, before Anthony Flew, he was a well-known atheist. Before he died, he actually kind of shifted, and it really made everybody else mad. He kind of shifted and said, there must be intelligent design. In other words, everything that you see in creation, there's no way that it just came about. There had to be a designer. There had to be somebody that put it together. It just doesn't happen. The argument is the watchmaker argument. The idea is that you could take this watch, and imagine taking all these pieces of this watch and taking it apart on the ground and picking up all those pieces, throwing it up into the air, and what are the chances that it comes right back together? Well, just about impossible, I would think. So this designer of this watch put it together to make it work. And with the intricacies of our creation all around us, there has to have been somebody that put it all together. And the Christian says, God did. The atheist says, I don't believe in God. It just came about. The agnostic says, I don't know. I don't know how it happened. He doesn't know. Paul tells the Romans, these people should be able to look at creation and see the design that's there and know about God. And because they can see it, notice what it says. It's been clearly perceived. It's been shown to them. It has been known and it is plain to them. And therefore, they are without excuse. If we'll use logic and learn some logic and be able to reason with our atheistic and agnostic friends, I think we'll be better prepared to be able to talk to them about who God is. We're going to have to use some reasoning. And that's what he says, right? He says you're going to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason, a logic for why you do the things that you do. What a beautiful passage. The last point that I want to make this morning is that it requires tender regard. Tender regard. My version says that it takes gentleness and respect. He says you do it with gentleness and respect, because sometimes we lack tact. We lack tact. Sometimes we're rude and we're condescending and will not make any kind of headway in the progress of the gospel. And it's something we're going to have to overcome. I love this passage from Acts chapter 17, where Paul comes into this land where the people of Athens are worshiping all kinds of gods. And they have gods set up for every kind of god there is. A sun god, cloud god, rain god, dirt god, worm god, roach god, dog god, every kind of god that there could possibly be. They've set up all these different idols to every god because they wanted to cover all of their bases so that anybody that came into their town, into their city, would be able to feel comfortable because they are all inclusive. And Paul takes this wonderful opportunity to talk to these people about a God that they don't know about. Matter of fact, they wanted to cover their bases so much that they erected a title or a idol and titled on that idol to the unknown God, the one that we don't know anything about, the one that we're not sure about. We're agnostic toward this fella. And Paul takes that opportunity to preach to them about the God that they know nothing about. He says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." But the point that I want to bring out here is not just what Paul is doing right there, but how Paul does it. It's amazing to me to see how he actually takes the moment to compliment them. I love the fact that he says, "I see that in every way you are religious." And that's a good strategy that we can take with our atheistic friends. You can compliment them, because I know people who are atheistic or that are agnostic, and they're actually very good people. And you can start saying things like, "You know what? I know you're a good person. I know that you're moral. I want to talk to you about why you're moral and where you got your morality." And so you compliment them. Years ago, it was 2004, May of 2004, Kira and I and Dr. Myers and some other students, I think Keith Harris actually was with us on this trip. We went to Brazil. Belo Horizonte, Brazil. We went around to these different cities and door clapped. That's what they call it. You don't knock on doors. They've got gates around their property, and you stand outside their gate and you clap your hands, and then they come out to talk to you. We're walking through, and Kira and I had a translator with us, and this fella's out there just gardening away in his front yard, and I like gardening, and I can talk about gardening a little bit, and so that's what I started this conversation with. I said, "Oh, look, your plants, they look wonderful. And we start talking a little bit about gardening, and then we start talking about who made the garden, who made the seeds, who makes the leaf, who makes the rain come, who makes the sun come. Before too long, we're talking about God. Before too long, we're talking about Christ. Before too long, we're talking about the church. And it starts with just this compliment of saying, man, your garden looks great. And all I'm saying is if we'll talk to our neighbors who have a different worldview than us with gentleness and with respect, maybe even compliment them, we can do more good than evil. It's a great tactic. Notice what he says, in every way you're religious. And I love the fact that he says, therefore what you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. He even tells them, you worship something. You know, even our atheistic friends, they worship something. It may be even themselves. They may be worshiping things. They may be worshiping their jobs. They may be worshiping their spouse. They may be worshiping anything. Fill in the blank. We can use that and talk to them about it with great respect and with great gentleness. And we can do some good in people's lives. Listen, I wanted to give you so many great anecdotes about atheism and agnosticism, maybe even provide some Christian evidences for you, showing you how God exists. But those are things that you can look up on your own time. If there's anything that I wanted to accomplish this morning, is to motivate you to talk to people who have a different worldview than you. And I think that this passage from 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 provides this kind of motivation for us. It encourages us to talk to our neighbors. And it encourages us to have a commitment in our own hearts first, that we're going to live the way we're supposed to live, that we're going to make the preparations ahead of time and do our homework. We're going to have to come up with some logical reasoning, understand where they're coming from, and understand the facts of nature. And it's going to take us having a tender regard for who they are. That's what I wanted to accomplish this morning. I wanted you to be motivated to talk to your neighbors who believe differently than you. Why? Because you love your neighbor. That's what we're all about. Loving our neighbors. You know what's interesting about this is like I said, every single person in this room has maybe a different level that they are right now in their own faith. And these are a lot of requirements that we find in this verse. But if we love our neighbors, and even ones that believe differently than we do, then we'll make a difference in their lives, and perhaps even an eternal difference in their lives. But let me ask you this question. Does your faith struggle? Are there times when you don't know if God exists or not? Are there times where you have thought, I don't believe in God? Well, that's everybody, I think. I think everybody struggles with that. I think everybody is at one time or another in their life questioning even God's existence. But don't think that you can't get out of that if you're in it, in that low point. This church family is here for you. Lean on your neighbors that are in the pew next to you. Why? Because they love you and you love Him. You love them. They'll help you get through it. We can do this together. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation this morning, come as together we stand and as we sing.